Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome.
Hello. Hello.
We're just going to give everybody a moment to hop into the meeting. Can you guys let us know in the chat where you're all from, all the people who are attending? We love to hear all the different places all over the world where everybody's chatting in from. Well, we've got Utah, Boston, India. That's great.
Canada.
Canada, Austin, Texas, New York,
Colorado.
New
Zealand. I want to go there.
Cyprus too. I saw Cyprus.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
It's so nice to have you all here today. We're so excited to talk to you about accessibility and boom cards and just the future of accessibility in EdTech. South Carolina, New Jersey. Well, welcome everyone. Got Maine, Pennsylvania. So Linda is having some trouble joining us.
If she's having trouble using that link, she might use the trick I did.
Sounds like a good trick. Well, in the meantime, we'll kind of get started and then give her some time to join us. So we want to start off by welcoming you all and thanking you for joining us on this panel on accessibility in education. My name is Kari Lisa Johnson. I'm the marketing director for Boom Learning. And we've shared in the chat some links so that you can get to know Boom Learning's YouTube channel, our Facebook page, the symposium schedule, and the next events. There are only 2 left, so we hope you'll join us. We're very excited to be partnering with some wonderful teachers for today's panel. Today, we're welcoming Angie Craft, Shannon Archer, Lisha Yochimowitz. Did I pronounce that right?
Close enough, Yochimowitz. You did good.
Okay, and Linda Wilson. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
And Linda is the one who's still trying to join us, so hopefully she'll be here before too long. We do want to let you know that we are recording this webinar, so this panel, so you'll be able to find the recording on our YouTube channel. We're also live streaming it on our Facebook page. And we have the chat box where everybody's been putting their location. So feel free to add that if you haven't already. We are also offering certificates of attendance for all of the events in the symposium. So to get a certificate of attendance, you can fill out the form that's provided in the follow-up email, and you'll need to answer a few questions just to confirm that you attended the entire panel. So you'll need to provide some information about yourself. And throughout the event, you'll be able to ask questions live. So some of those questions will be answered in writing, and some questions will be answered by the panelists. And you just put those questions in the Q&A box. And that way, everybody can see the answers and the questions. So at the end of the event, we'll be reposting those links as well as the link to the next event on the schedule, which is a panel about using boom cards for language acquisition, ESL, and ELL. So this link will allow you to move into the next room to continue following along with the entire symposium. So be sure to copy and paste any resources from the chat before the end of the session into a document so you won't lose them. Now, I'd like to turn to the panelists and kick off the discussion. Shannon, can you introduce yourself first and explain how you became interested in education?
Yes, hi. My name is Shannon Archer. I'm a speech language pathologist, and I started specializing in using AAC early in my education career when I worked in school system in Texas. And then when I transitioned out to California, I was the AA specialist for the district, but they also needed someone to support assistive technology. And so I actually have been doing that for the last 5 years, and am just fascinated and just love how we can use technology to support our students, our clients, both for communication, but also for their education. And I think that's it.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I can't agree with you more. There are so many opportunities with new technology. Lisha, can you explain your teaching specialty and where your interest in accessible learning tools originated?
Sure. Hi, my name is Lisha, and I'm a teacher of the visually impaired, and I specialize in cortical cerebral vision impairment, which is brain-based vision impairment. I teach in the classroom. I started a website with a family called Seeing Sadie and CVI, and I'm also the content manager for PASD Illiteracy for Perkins School for the Blind. My love of learning is kind of where I started, as wanting to be a teacher and share that love of learning. And I got into special education almost by accident while at college as a regular ed teacher. Just they had a great program. So I became a teacher of the visually impaired and started work at Overbrook School for the Blind in Philadelphia. And here I am today, trying to make materials, especially now with technology, accessible to all learners.
That's wonderful. So you really just started taking classes and fell in love.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So Linda, I'm so glad you could join us. Could you introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Hi, I'm Linda Wilson. I am a preschool education teacher, special education teacher by training, but I have always been interested in using technology with kids and started over 30 years ago, even during my undergrad years, using technology with kids with disabilities from babies all the way up. And today I am the team leader of the High Incidence Accessible Technology Team, which is our AT team in a large school district. And our team focuses on the concept of accessibility in trying to make accessibility accessible, if you will, to a wide audience. So making sure that everyone in our school system understands what it means and what you need to know about accessibility.
And you're in Montgomery County, correct?
Right, in Maryland.
Yeah, so connecting people with the right tools that they need to be able to learn. So Angie, can you explain how you became interested in accessibility?
Well, I'll start with, like, when I was 5 years old, I told my mom and dad I was going to be a teacher. My dad was a guidance counselor. At 15, I started taking sign language classes and became interested in that. I have my undergrads in elementary ed and deaf education, K through 12, and my master's in special ed. I've taught multi-disabled deaf students for 33 years in Sarasota County, and I'm currently working as an academic interventionist at a center school here in Sarasota County, where we have the most restrictive environment for our students. We have the most talented students in Sarasota County. So that's how I became interested.
Okay, Linda, can you maybe tell us why you think accessibility is so important? Oh, you're muted.
There we go. It ensures that, just like that, like having sound makes things accessible, right? It ensures that everyone can benefit from the great activities that you make. So, imagine if you put all this time and effort into creating something meaningful for your students, but then you found that a couple of your students weren't able to benefit from it in the way that you imagined. you'd have to kind of retrofit. You'd have to go back and create something new just for those two kids. And teachers do this all the time. They create something for their class, and then they go and retrofit for the couple of kids who have individualized needs. And if we think about accessibility in a broader way, we can think about those things ahead of time and create materials that are good for everyone. And then what you find out is that they benefit even more students than you imagined. And so accessibility not only makes things accessible to all your students, but it also makes them better in most cases. And so that's why it's really important.
And the students might change every year. So if you're retrofitting things to fit a particular student, it saves a lot of time to just use best practices in the first place.
That's so true. And we always say it saves time. And then people push back on us because they're like, but it takes more time to think and plan this way, which is true. But overall, it's going to save you a lot of time, not just in creating, but also in teaching and in reaching your students.
Well, Lisha, I was going to ask you a little bit about universal design approach, because I know that's something that you brought up in the blog post that you did with Boom Learning. And so I wanted to know if you could explain a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So I learned about the universal design approach in graduate school, and it's a concept that's really taken off. Luckily, it actually started in architecture back in the 1950s, and then it really took off in the 1970s with the Disabilities Act and making buildings accessible to people who might not be able to go up steps or open doors without assistance. So that's how it took off. There was a man named Ron Mace, who was the architecture, who really started the 7 design principles of universal design. And then luckily in education, we kind of picked up that approach. And now we use it as a common sense approach to making everything we design and produce that could be accessible to almost everyone. You don't want to say everyone because there's always exceptions, but to the greatest extent possible. So if we're making something, because I'm from, a vision background, simple and high contrast and not so cluttered that there's so much going on, and sticking to what we really need to see as a learning content material that is great for everybody and not just for our visually impaired students. So that's kind of how the educational field is using universal design for learning in this context.
Great. Well, Shannon, do accessible tools benefit all students? As you create content for Boom Learning, can you provide an example of how accessible design might help everyone, not just a student with special accessibility needs?
Yes, absolutely. So I want you to think about something that probably all of you have and you all use probably every day. Your nice little iPhone, or, and how often do you use speech to text, or maybe have Siri read something for you? These are 2 accessibility features that are something that is 5-10 years ago, or something that we paid hundreds of dollars to have programs, special programs, and they were clunky and you had to load them. Nowadays we have, screen readers, we have text to speech, and this opens so many doors for so many different students. So and a tool that I use a lot with my a lot of my middle school, high school students is speech to text and screen reading. And it's something that is honestly all of us use, but all can use. And so when I'm designing, whether it's something for Boom cards or, something for the classroom, one of the things that I talk about are things that you do within the design process for that universal design, universal access. So there's things like text size, colors. There's, as Linda talked about, you know, how much is on the screen. So there's things that we can do visually to support our students. The other thing that I do when I'm designing, now the interesting thing is that I actually have to go back, and I love the new alt text feature. This is for pictures. This is something that kind of snuck up, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so awesome. And so I'm actually going back and adding that to a lot of the boom cards that I create. Also adding in text, the ability to adding in my brain just took a second.
Maybe the tab navigation is another thing we added recently that allows compatibility with Switch devices.
That is fantastic. And probably from an AAC perspective, I'm just like beyond excited because, you know, I have a lot of kids. I use a lot of the same materials that for my speech students that we're working on language as I do when I'm working with AAC. I have a lot of therapists or teachers will say, well, what can I use? I'm like, well, if you're working on language, this activity is great. So now what we can do is we can take those activities and we can tweak some of the designs with adding the text, adding, looking at alt text, looking at using the Z order for tab navigation, which is so exciting, especially for some of my kids that are using different access. That is just probably one of my favorite new tools, and also the alt text, because I just think that's awesome. But another thing that I've done when I'm designing things, especially in boom cards, is I look at how can I design something so an individual who is a reader, a non-reader, can access this. What are things that I can do within the design? So sometimes it's adding a number above a choice. Sometimes it's adding a shape or a color or a design so that an individual can tell me what they want me to do or what they want to do when they may not be able to read, or they may not be able to you know, they may not be able to label the item. So there's so many different ways that we can just improve our students' ability to access boom cards, and then, you know, even Google Sides. And I mean, there's so many, it's such a big, and you give me like this little bit of time, but just some simple things, you know, like what if
I think to your point, Shannon, a huge part of why we wanted to have this panel was to maybe do an education piece, because we have all these great new tools for accessibility in the product, but unless the publishers or the creators understand how to use them, then the students don't get the end benefit. So what we try to do is create a lot of really flexible tools that then enable an individual classroom teacher or a specialist to go in and make a whole bunch of different kinds of activities. And so we did get a question in the chat about what is alt text. And so, yeah, Mary's answering it, but I'll also just say that it's something that enables screen readers like VoiceOver or TalkBack. And the cool thing is we actually go back and forth with all of our creators to say, hey, is this working the way it should be? And that was one of the things leading up to this panel that Shannon and I touched base, because she was using a particular voice to text product where it wasn't working correctly. And so we even pulled into this meeting one of our developers so that she can listen to what you have to say and make changes and improve the product over time, so that we are offering everybody the best tools to make a large number of different types of products for different learners. So not to go on too long a rant, I definitely just touch base on that, because it is a nice back and forth that we have with our users, because you're going to know how things are really being used with real learners in a way that we're one step removed from. So I'm so appreciative to Shannon for pointing out some of those things that you noticed. And the other example is Z order, because depending on the Z order, the Z order just means the order of the images on the page or the order of the elements on the page. That impacts how the tab navigation works. And the tab navigation is the ability to navigate through the page without using a mouse. You could just use shift tab and the space bar. So yeah, so not to go too deep into the weeds here, but maybe we can ask another question for Linda, which is, what do you think that all educators should know about accessibility?
Well, you know, I think the most important thing to know about accessibility is that it's not one discipline, it's contextual. And that's the hardest part, because as Shannon's talking, people are asking, well, what is alt text? There's some technical things you need to know. And Kari, as you mentioned, the features might be there, but that's not good enough. People need to know not just how to use them, but why to use them. And what it means is there's a little bit of technical knowledge you need, and there's pedagogical knowledge you need. You need to know your students, and you need to know how your students learn so that you can imagine how the activity you're creating will work for them. So, you know, what I say to people when they're like, oh, I need to know everything there is to know about accessibility, I say, well, you know, start with the basics, which people have already mentioned, like you want your text to be read out loud by a screen reader. You want your images to have alt text so they can be read by the screen reader. You don't want to depend just on sounds without a visual and text to support it. You know, so those are some technical things that are just kind of general rules. You don't want to overcrowd your page. You want to have color contrast, all that, all those basics will give you sort of that general baseline. But then if you're not sure, think about your students. If you know your students, and, you know, not just the students that you have this year, but the ones you've had in the past, because then you can design, as you said earlier, you know, your students change every year. So think about your students in general and imagine them using whatever you're creating. And that requires pedagogical knowledge. And so you can't really go to a tech person and say, how do I make this accessible? And you can't really go to a teacher and say, how do I make this accessible without the technology knowledge? And then just one more piece that, you know, because I'm sure lots of people are listening who may be more in an administrative role or a district-wide role, is there's also an element of purchasing that you have to understand, because there are laws about accessibility. And, you know, boy, the world would be so much easier if people knew what these laws were and followed them. So for example, when we bought Boom Cards, one of the first questions I asked was, do you guys have a VPAT? And that is a template and V stands for voluntary. So vendors have an opportunity to write up a template based on all the different accessibility standards and give a description in layperson's terms as to how their product meets the standards. And a lot of people don't know that. They don't know that they have purchasing power to say to a vendor, I want a product that meets the basic accessibility standards so that we can, you know, not have to do that retrofitting with our kids. So for me, it's really, there's some discipline in the middle of teaching pedagogy, technology knowledge, and purchasing. And that purchasing part is something, you know, not a lot of us spend our days thinking about purchasing. But I realized how important that was as I came into this field, because I'm also responsible for managing the licenses for, you know, the various software products that we buy.
Even from the teacher perspective, it's kind of about knowing before you set off to make something new, asking the right questions. So asking the right questions as an admin, like, hey, does this vendor have the documentation that we need? And then asking as a teacher, what can I do to be more inclusive with this worksheet that I'm planning on turning into an app, turning into an activity? How can I make it accessible for more students? And our next panel is actually on ESL, ELL, ENL. That's another one where you really can think about your student population at wherever you're teaching or wherever you're a specialist, and think, do people need reading supports? You know, are there supports that students need to help them have a better opportunity and more equity? So here's a question for everyone. How has the approach to teaching students with visual or hearing impairments evolved over the years? Like, how are things different now than they might have been 30 years ago?
I can answer part of that one.
Yeah, go for it, Angie.
When I got into Deaf Ed, one of the things we were using was called C-Sign, and it's Signing Exact English. And the thought back then in the late 70s, early 80s was that you would sign exact English, and that would teach them English grammar, and that the deaf students would be able to read more fluently. And it was a huge mistake. The children didn't understand it. And it's just enlightening to see after 30 years how we've evolved into ASL, and how it's been, how there's more people that are using it, that now that we have teachers that are certified in Deaf Ed, that know how to teach deaf children, that know how to meet the accessibility needs for students, that have certified interpreters, and can understand the grammatical intricacies of ASL. So, and then even when I first started teaching, I remember a student, he just wanted, he's like, someday I want to have the ability to talk to somebody and just be able to sign to them. And, I can't use a phone, without having someone, intervene and be the middleman and be the translator for me. And now we have FaceTime, and we have social media, and they have all this access to this technology that makes it possible. So it's just evolved leaps and bounds with the technology that we have today. And when I was designing boom cards last year, just having the ability to be able to sign something and then put a video into the boom deck, that taught the precursor for what skill I was looking for. It's just fascinating. I love having the technology that we have today versus what I had 30 years ago, which was Apple IIe on an Oregon Trail or something. So we didn't have a whole lot back then.
And it's, when you think about what's coming in the future, it's probably only going to be more inclusive and more capable of having students learn together in the same environment, but with differentiation and supports as needed, right. which is great for when you think about classrooms as a community and really having everybody be included.
Yes, that's what we're working on now. Each one of our classrooms at our school is very diverse. And so you have a mixture of students with different challenges in there. And so making sure that everybody accesses education to their full benefit is, one of our main goals. So that's part of my job, where I go in and try to make everything accessible to everyone.
Yeah, and you said that the groups were more and more mixed. That's been a recent trend in the last few years. Is that right? Yes.
So we used to, it used to be all the deaf students would be in one classroom, or all the physically impaired students would be in another classroom, and now we've gone to a mixture of different abilities in the classroom, and all, so the teachers have a wide range of abilities in the classroom. So it's my job to go in and make sure that everybody's accessing education to the best of their benefit, best of their ability.
Lisha, do you think that the pandemic taught you anything about how educators can use EdTech or education technology effectively? I know we had talked before about how the idea of teaching a visually impaired student over the iPad seemed completely impossible before the
daunting.
pandemic.
Yeah, it was daunting. And then guess what? We did it. So I think we realized how capable we are when we have to be put in a position of thinking outside the box, and the brick and mortar classrooms were changing and evolving. And then the pandemic hit and we were like, oh no, wait, I can't even leave my house. How do I get to these children who, you know, desperately need to learn, you know, the content for their school year? So which is why I think boom cards just took off, because it was at a certain time in our history when we needed access to technology that's going to really benefit our students. And we didn't have the luxury of time. We needed it today. So I see the burnout rate as a real thing because of all of the stresses teachers were put under for the pandemic. But I think what's coming now, what's evolved as we hopefully are at the tail end of this, is a greater understanding of how we can access learning in different ways. I've had parents tell me that the pandemic was a blessing because their child was able to access learning in a different way, as opposed to being in a classroom with 20 some students and overstimulated and not being able to focus on their content. And now with the ability to use technology, we are able to really give them specifics of what they need so that they can learn their content and not be distracted so much. So I think it's taught us a lot of one size does not fit all, and we can rise to the occasion of meeting the needs of each child a little bit better.
And can you describe a little bit about what you have going on in your background?
Sure. So this is something that I've been playing with. When I look at boom cards, a lot of times I'll see someone say this is CVI friendly, which means a brain-based visual impairment. A lot of autistic children, a lot of children with dyslexia also benefit from this. When you use a solid colored background without a lot of borders, if you use real pictures as opposed, like if I think of a polar bear, instead of using a caricature polar bear with maybe swim trunks on, making things as real as possible. So this is one that I use with my student. She's a beginning reader, so obviously today is not dog, but it's a nonsensical word. So what I do is a very solid background. I use Dr. Roman word bubbling, so it highlights the word. Most students don't need that, but it's helpful, doesn't hurt anyone. And then she has two choices, both in very simple, large font with different colors, and it's underlined. So there's not anything else going on. She just has to read today is, and she knows the word dog. She might not know the word rainy, so she's problem solving and not distracted by other things going on that particular card.
And that's been a huge thing that we're focusing on as we think about redesigning the app and the website. Is how do you reduce cognitive load? How do you get things down to just what's the most important here? And I think having those skills, whether you're making boom cards or doing anything, it can be really helpful. So Boom Learning recently received certifications from Digital Promise in both learner variability and research-based design. I wanted to know, Angie, if you could describe an example of learner variability from your own students, like the ways that the learners might need different supports.
I've modified, what I did was I took all of the state standards that we're working on for Datafolio, and I modified them to errorless all the way through to fill in the blank. You know, matching, sorting, and I tried to use as many different ways to cover as many different skill sets as I needed for the different groupings from 3rd grade all the way through 12th. So because I'm working with, I think there's about 120, 150 access point students that we have at our school. So I was trying to design stuff that met the needs of most of this population. I've only been working with boom cards for like a year and a half. So I'm going to be modifying a lot of that. Some of the things that I haven't included in every one that I will is having the voiceover box so that the students can tap it and it will read for them. I didn't include that in all of it. A lot of my students, a couple of my students were deaf or hard of hearing. And so sign language was a big component in theirs. And I was working on some students with the CVI and helping the teachers, and they would come to me because that's not my background. They would come to me and say, I need it to have a blue background, or I need the lettering to be blue and yellow, or I need the black background to be black, you know. And so I was able to modify boom decks for them and then send them to them. And then as we're going into this school year, whatever needs to be modified, I'm so excited because our school bought boom. So everybody's going to have it. We're going to have a library that they can choose from, and they can go in, they can modify it to meet the needs of their students this year. So they'll have
you said that your standards based material were so popular that everybody was wanting to use it beyond the group that you initially created them for, right?
I started out small for a couple of classrooms. And then by the end of the school year, I was sharing quite a bit of them. And so I was really excited to see that I told everybody, we're going to have a library so you could just check it out, you know, and everybody's going to have the same thing. So I won't have to continually go back and share this group of 40 or this group of 30, you know, different boom decks for different groups and all. I was, sending out boom decks quite a bit every day. So, yeah, but hopefully, now we're working on training and enabling these teachers to be able to go back and modify them to meet the needs of their students.
Perfect. So Lisha, I did want to loop back because we had a question from the audience about Dr. Roman's word bubbling. And I see you sent the link in the chat.
Yeah, I just sent the link. Dr. Roman is a teacher of the visually impaired who's done endless research on cortical vision impairment, which is obviously what I specialize in. So I sent it, and it's a really handy free little tool that they could use and experiment with. And you can include it in your boom cards if you want or not. So you could check it out.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Shannon, I wanted to ask, is there anything that you wish more people knew about boom cards?
Oh gosh. So what I wish that more people knew is that I think during the pandemic, you know, it was, okay, well, we're going to be using a lot of digital technology. So, you know, we can use this now. And then as we've been going back in person, people are like, okay, well, I don't need to use boom cards anymore. I'm like, excuse me, there are so many amazing tools. I mean, the minute I started making boom cards, I was like, just make them right and left because, you know, as a speech therapist, I work with kids from kindergarten, literally all the way up into transition age, 21. And I work with people with articulation, with language, autism, fluency. I mean, so many things. I don't have enough money for enough games and activities, but being able to, like boom card and teachers pay teachers, it's like I can make exactly what my students need, and I can add my little flair, I can add my humor. You know, there's so many fun things that you can do to make learning more fun. I mean, what I love about it is my kids don't even necessarily know that you know, that we're working on something because we're able to make it fun. And so it's like that bait and switch. We're not working on stuff, we're doing fun. So
I think one of the challenges of the pandemic was kind of thinking that the onus was on the teacher to learn a whole new set of lessons, when in reality, it's possible to take the things that you've developed over 35, 40 years and make them work in an interactive way. And that's going to, I think, be a lot more powerful because those lessons that each individual specialist or teacher has developed over years and years, there's, you know, in a sense, there's no textbook company that's going to come up with something that has as much user testing with your exact community. And so being able to kind of take a magic wand and turn your worksheet into a game that's really engaging and gives you full reports is making it a lot easier.
And one thing just I wanted to add that I found is that as we went back in person, I'm still using them and using them more. I finally feel like I have the ability to easily and effectively make activities that I can use, whether I'm doing teletherapy, whether I'm in person. And I know I sound like I'm probably being paid, but I know I'm not. That's what I love about it, is that this is something you can use. And as a speech therapist, I still do a lot in teletherapy, but I see kids individually, I see kids in groups. And so, Boom Cards gives me the ability to not only make activities for my students, I get to reuse them. They don't get torn up. They don't get thrown around. They don't get there's all those things. And I can use them in person or via teletherapy. So it's been a fantastic learning tool.
So I know we had said we're not going to share screens during this session, but we did have someone from the audience, Sue, ask for an example. So if anybody does want to pull up a Boom card to just share, I might explain some of the accessibility features and the technology. And basically, I think what's really important to understand is that there are custom play settings so that you can deliver differentiated content to different students. You can hide more difficult material, you can randomize it or do it in ascending order of difficulty. And then also there are the accessibility features we mentioned, which include tab navigation, alt text, but we have our full VPAT that Mary has posted in the chat as well. But
I want to say something to tie kind of some of the things we've talked about together. Sure. About flexible design. As we're talking about teachers who came back to school and said, oh, okay, I don't have to do that anymore. And this is a core tenet of universal design for learning that Lisha was talking about earlier. So, we talk about creating something that is flexible, meaning that kids can access it in the way that works best for them. So if you have a book on paper and it requires you to have the fine motor skills to open it and the visual skills to see the font in whatever size it was created in, and the reading skills to read it, and all of those things put together, you can imagine that in any one classroom, you'd have somebody with a fine motor challenge, somebody else with a reading challenge, somebody else with a visual challenge, a parent at home with a language challenge or whatnot, or, me who had to get reading glasses recently. But if that book is created digitally at the outset, you can always print it if you prefer a paper format. But it's not true in the other direction. And that is a value of technology that I think some of us realize and jump on right away. And others of us who are a little more tentative or fearful, or, it takes us a little bit longer to learn how to use technology tools, that effort that you put in to learn how to create something digitally in the first place, it's not forcing your kids to be on screens all the time, but it is helping you create materials that you can quickly revise, that you can give out to kids in different formats. And so, we call those flexible formats, we call that flexible design. But the key point is that we're creating things with accessibility at the outset instead of after the fact. That's where that time saving comes in. And that's a way that we can kind of hook people into using technology, even though there is a learning curve there, especially any tool like Boom Cards where you can design your own thing, there is absolutely going to be a learning curve.
Yeah, our CTO always compares it to PowerPoint in that probably if you can use PowerPoint, you can use the Boom Studio, but it does take some learning. You have to figure it out. You have to experiment a little bit in order to make it happen.
That's what drew me to Boom Cards. was the flexibility to be able to modify and change things the way they needed to be, you
Yes.
know, and I mean, all of us special ed teachers have spent years modifying things to better meet the needs of the students that are in our classroom and all that stuff. And Boom gives you that flexibility. So I think that's one of the things that really drew me to it. And now that you guys have added a whole bunch of features, I can't wait to use those and get
The first of
involved with
many.
those.
There'll be more coming, so stay tuned.
Yay.
And then I did have one more question, and then we're pretty much at time. So before I get to this last question, I just want to make sure to thank you all so much for joining this panel and sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it. And so we did have a question about using a smart board, because this educator said, sadly, many of my students don't have access to an iPad as I work in a public school. How can I make it more interactive for them if I'm the only one who can interact with the Boom cards? Do you guys have any suggestions? Yeah.
So I have this, I call it my secret. And okay, this is possibly for younger kids, but one of the things I did is I made my own magic interactive board because I don't have one. So I use the magic pointer, and the kids actually will go up and choose things, and I have my mouse right there and I'm actually clicking the mouse. So I put it up. I have, you know, like the old fashioned you know, image on the wall. That's great. But, you know, at least it's taking my computer, and then, you know, I allow kids to go up and touch it and I have a yardstick, or I have the magic pointer, and then I'm actually controlling it. But my younger kids, and even my older kids, even when they know that it's actually me still controlling it and being interactive, they still love it. So it's just, you know, being creative.
I've seen the same thing with a fly swatter. You'd be surprised how much
Yes.
of doing the fly swatter, even if it's not immediate.
Yep.
Well, thank you guys so much. Really, it's been an incredibly illuminating session, and we hope to continue to work with you more in the future on improving and offering even more accessibility tools. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I learned something
Thank you.
new every time I talk to other people, so thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Too.
Yes, thank you.
Just a friendly reminder to everyone in the audience, you can join us for our next symposium event, which is a panel about using Boom cards for language acquisition, ESL and ELL, which is starting next. You can find a link to it in the chat. The Boom Back to School Symposium has a number of sessions, and we hope you'll join us for the last two that are left, but you'll also be able to see YouTube videos for any of the ones that you missed. So we have a social hour at 3:30 today that requires no registration. Thank you again, and happy booming, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon or evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.